Hi, welcome to my presentation, Hackers Paradise, Top 10 Biggest Threats When Working From Home. My name is Paula Januszkiewicz, and I'm the CEO of Secure, also a regional director of Microsoft, and also a person who has access actually to the source code of Windows for the past 10 years. And I'm absolutely happy to share insights that are covering the current situation when we are all working from home in order to cover the biggest threats that we have encountered within the last projects, and also interesting observations from what to do in order to become more secure while technically sitting at home. So regarding the agenda for today, there are a couple of things here to cover. First of all, we're going to discuss the security awareness idea. So what's happening right now in this world. Then we're going to dig into top 10 biggest threats. And then, of course, we're going to get into the summary. So as we already know, we are in the state where we are working from home. We are working from locations that are not necessarily being in our offices. And there are different recommendations and different organizations that are creating those recommendations regarding the remote work. For example, one of the agencies, which is called CISA, they have actually issued a recommendation that organizations should adopt to the conditions that we got currently in the world in order to enforce or enrich our security solutions to avoid known vulnerabilities and known threats that are out there. For example, when we take into consideration phishing being the number one threat currently in the world, that is the very generic recommendation that they are making. CISA being one of the organizations out there, is technically the Department of Homeland Security Cyber Agency, but they are, of course, not the only ones. Yeah? So we've got, for example, Checkpoint that shared research that shows that cyber criminals are actually using coronavirus pandemic to spread, for example, spam activity through both email campaigns and malicious domains. So whenever we take into consideration some other aspects that are related with the remote work, we're also observing that we've got employees, of course, sometimes using their personal device for work, or eventually sharing that particular device with some other people, for example, members of the family. We've got employees connecting, for example, to the company's network from their home Wi-Fi or some public unknown Wi-Fi, which technically creates different situations that are very comfortable for hackers to be eventually misused, and at the same time allowing us to access the employee's computer. So that could be work device, personal device, and eventually maybe hop through the corporate network. And here we are discussing, of course, many types of attacks. That could be through phishing. That could be, for example, through being in the same subnet and then eventually affecting the traffic, affecting the communication that employee is using over here in order to, for example, to browse simply websites. Or in general, these kind of problems are also usually starting when we are mixing two worlds. So our private world with our corporate or in general work world, when, for example, we are using applications or in general websites with the social media, so things like Facebook and so on, which could, for example, lead to an attack, to a code execution on our computers. Of course, if that's allowed, if the company allows it, and then spread across the organization's network. So whenever we are thinking, of course, about these top 10 biggest threats when working from home, some of them are simple and some of them are a little bit more advanced. So let me start with something simple as a warm-up, and that is actually related with the situation where we disable firewall or in general different security solutions that are working on our, for example, personal device that could be used for work related purposes, or either if we've got a possibility to affect security solutions on the work device, that could be also the case, or it could be also misconfiguration of the firewall that allows the different processes that are technically suspicious, not allowed within our organization's policy to be communicating out of the network. Which brings me actually to a technical explanation where we've got, for example, certain macro that we are receiving within the phishing email, and then macro opens up a child process. That child process could be, for example, PowerShell, which technically is an allowed process within the Windows platform. And then eventually that particular process is communicating out to the networks, to the internet in general, in order, for example, to fetch some other items that could be used within the attack. Yeah, so and the second part, it's something else there, but what is important is that there is a child process like PowerShell that from macro opens up and then tries to establish communication, which is clearly an anomaly. So what I would like to show you in the demonstration is the perfect example of that. Let's have a look how through a malicious macro, we are able to take over a certain workstation. So the demo, it's called Initial Access Privilege Escalation.
What you see on the screen right now, it's just Netcat. So we're going to be listening for the incoming connections. And in here, there's a microsoftonline.com.co. You probably guys recognize that it's not a Microsoft domain, right? That's the domain that we use for phishing activities, but it is so similar to the Microsoft one. So over here, there's an attachment. And as you can see, over here, we've got similar looking document. So technically, the whole thing over here, it is an image. So we enable content for the macros. User clicks somewhere inside of the document. There is a reverse shell, and that reverse shell is in the form of executable this time, and it creates a connection to the hacker. When we check out the macro, over here, you can see that there's just one big button, and here is a URL download to file, and we are downloading certain executable in the text file, see? So then we are renaming that to that executable, so .exe. And over here, we are running that refkali.exe. And being on the hacker side, if we run whoami/all, you can see that we are this user right now. So we managed to become a user, as you can see, Paula, and eventually this user is just a user because of the privileges that are listed. So this is how, of course, we are able to recognize who we are. But it doesn't really matter. So we can here get into curl and technically our machine, payloads, privsec, and then eventually we're going to be running the PS1. So that's the PowerShell. And that is the script that eventually we are able to use for the privs escalation, so for the privilege escalation in this computer. So we can set up a set execution policy bypass, scope, and then process. And then for that moment, we will be able to run scripts that are not digitally signed. You can always do it, by the way. And right now, when we run our priv escalation script, that's actually a DLL hijacking, then here you are able to see that we are using some DLL, and that particular DLL, we're going to be loading by the task scheduler upon the service startup. And here we are using also the internal Windows mechanisms. So everything is, of course, something specific over here. But at the end, we are able to recognize also what's running on this user's computer to effectively run the attack. And in here, we're going to do curl, reverse DLL, and we specify the output. We've got the Python 27 DLL, and we're going to be leveraging this particular DLL within the attack. So this is the DLL that we have named over here. This is how, by the way, we can hide, yes, to put it in some kind of a DLL, into some kind of a folder, and eventually a DLL that's not digitally signed, maybe amongst other DLLs that are also not signed out for this solution. So when we're going to shut down the computer, we still set up a listener, and on the client side, we have set up also the persistency. And this particular DLL, when it's going to be loaded by one of the mechanisms, one of the solutions, even in Windows operating system, then you can see that that persistency allowed us to connect back to the Netcat, to the listening hacker. And at that stage, we are actually escalating to system, because from the moment when we were starting the service and so on, that was actually running as system. So because we were able to drop a DLL into the certain location, we could at the end also run it with the escalated or elevated privileges.
So as you can see, guys, we were able to take over a certain machine just because we were able to run the code through the macro. Now, it was not the simplest possible macro that we got, because underneath we were using the system mechanisms in order to gain persistency. So these kind of situations might lead to a further execution. And of course, there are many problems here that we could cover. Yeah, so one thing would be user awareness. Another part would be why, in general, this email made to our mailbox. Another part might be related why that code even executed, why there were no attack surface reduction rules. So there are plenty of situations that might not be covered on the personal workstation that might be used, for example, for the work purposes. Another part that I would like to touch base on is overly simple password and security questions. And that in general covers situation where companies do not have yet implemented multi-factor authentication. That's one thing. And using that simplest example that I've got within that one of the latest projects is when I was doing the password spraying for the organization, because that's technically my job, and I'm not leaving technology, even though I got a business role within the company. I did the simplest possible attack for the approximately 6,000 users, and they did not have multi-factor authentication. And then it appeared that 29 actually of users in this example, they had a password which consisted of the company name and also a year. So again, not very surprising, right? But so that is just enough to use, for example, one user in order to be able to spread further and then send phishing, which is no longer phishing because this is an email that is actually sent by our friend. So let's have a look how that kind of situation could be escalated further. What I would like to show you, it's a situation how, for example, we are able to sometimes give away our password. Because multi-factor authentication is one thing, but the second thing is simply phishing that is encouraging us to give away credentials that could be later potentially used within the further components of the infrastructure.
In this demonstration, we've got a machine that's connected to a certain network. And if we open up the browser and query demo secureacademy.com/admin, like you see, then here we can enter a username, secure-demo, and certain password, and then you get a happy raccoon. We are able to successfully log in. Now, another part, it's going to be secureacademy.com, and over here, we're going to be also launching the website that is as well, or could be as well, HTTPS. And over here, we could do secure-demo and enter the password, and then there is a bad raccoon. So these are the two similarly looking websites, but these are really two different websites where we are able to extract passwords at that stage from the login form. So this is the setup. Now we can just close the cards all here, and what will be our goal is to verify the IP address of secureacademy.com and compare it with secureacademy.com. So here we are not really acting on the DNS yet. It's just these are two different sites. So we've got an IP address given and the name, and then we've got also the Secure Academy, which we can see it's different. Now the next stage over here is that I'm going to pretend that I'm connecting to the network through the malicious access point. So I'm somewhere at the airport. I'm connecting to the free Wi-Fi, somewhere in a cafe. It doesn't really matter. I do not control my access point. So here I enter the secureacademy.com/admin, and that's the Secure Academy. Yes, but we do secure demo, and then we run the password, and then as you can see, it's just something wrong because we entered the correct address. How could it be that our credentials are actually leaking here? And it's the same, in this case, username and password that I typed. An answer to this question is actually very straightforward. We got over here demo.secureacademy.com, that's certain IP address, and also secureacademy.com, that's this certain address. Why this is possible? Because we, at that stage, control the access point that the user is connecting to.
So as you can see, we've got a situation where not only we were able to get the password of the user that was phished, but also through the possibility to control the access point, we were able to spoof the website and replace the website eventually either on the fly or just play with the DNS records in order to redirect the user to the incorrect website to give away credentials. Another problem over here, it's no network segmentation. And what I mean by this is that if there is a certain code running on the user's computer, then for example, a user is connected using the VPN, we've got a problem with the situation what the user sees. So things like VPN pivoting attack, it's perfectly working here. So just to mention, but that attack is based on the situation where attacker manages to be in the same network as the user, manages to get access to the user workstation, maybe through phishing, maybe through that kind of activity that you just guys could see in a demo. And eventually, the next step would be to treat user's workstation as a proxy. That's what's called VPN pivoting, because user is connected using VPN connection to the organization, and then the hacker is able, by using the workstation as a proxy, to see exactly the same stuff that the user could see in the infrastructure. And if, for example, user sees servers, some other services that are critical from the perspective of the organization, that eventually we call a shadow IT at the end, because there might be something that's misconfigured, not checked within the pentest, or maybe checked but not corrected, but being still there, then this is something that could be possibly used within the attack. So whenever we think about that, there's one thing that actually comes to my mind as well, and that's the lack of SMB signing. So if the hacker is able to see the same stuff that the user could see being connected through VPN, for example, by using VPN pivoting, we are able at the same time to try to launch the attacks like RP poisoning, and then eventually listen to the SMB related communication in between hosts. And when you combine that all together with NTLM version 2 authentication protocol, which is used in pair, let's say, or instead of Kerberos, for example, across local accounts, for example, across service accounts, or also when you use the short name, for example, // files, or when you use / IP address, then you trigger by default NTLM version 2, and then this being challenge response mechanisms is actually be able to be spoofed, and then you can relay the response to the target. And that is something that I would love to show you within the SMB relay attack.
Let's have a look at the simple attack where we're going to deliver SMB relay. SMB relay in general, it's relying on the situation where we have no SMB signing in the infrastructure, and at the same time we're using NTLM version 2 protocol for authentication. Now, this attack works in vast majority of organizations, and the problem is that, well, it's easy, but at the same time, there is a certain code that needs to execute, and it'll be great, of course, to know what are the ways to figure out that that particular code has actually executed. So for the SMB relay, I'm going to use SMB relay X Python script, as you see, and my target is going to be 10.10.10.250. And on execution, I'm going to run CQ shell 104a.exe, which is actually a reverse shell that is customized by our team. Now, the customization that is happening here is actually related with the discovery or non-discovery by the antivirus solution, but at the end, it's just a simple reverse shell. So that's going to be the first step. Second step that we got over here is related with the listener or handler for the incoming connections. And I have over here Metasploit, which I have simply set up, as you see, that's everything. So that's why this attack is so simple, to perform the handling of connections that are about to come if they run the reverse shell. So this is basically what's happening here. Now, that reverse shell in general is going to be running next because SMB relay itself, in order to establish a connection, to assure the session and so on, has to run its own executable, which we would like to trace afterwards. And that's going to be a very interesting situation to have a look at. So let's see. First of all, here we would just need to go exploit. And second thing here, we just need to run the script. Now, what I'm going to do on my side, it's going to be basically the query from a certain type of machine, so from one host to another, in order to query or trigger NTLM version 2 authentication. Now, that situation is actually quite straightforward, because querying by IP address different types of hosts in the infrastructure, it's quite a typical thing, right? So basically we do // and then we specify IP address. Now I'm going to here listen to incoming connections. So please have a look. Now I have queried a certain IP address in the infrastructure. Here we can do PS to list processes. And over here, I'm able to see that, for example, there's an SVC host running as NT authority system, which has process ID 3136. So let's do that, migrate 3136. And the migration process over here allows us to move our bad piece of code to that process. And this is a typical exploitation technique, not in the form of DLL and so on, but by modification of the memory address space of that process. Now, we are right now in that system. So if I press shell here, if we do who am I, you are able to see that we are actually system in that target system. So this is all good, but the question is, of course, how are we able to investigate that? Okay, and this is something that I would like to show you. So we were migrating the 3136, and we are able to see over here that it's from 2909. And once we did shell, then basically here there has been process created. So let's have a look how this activity reflects basically on our target machine. And it's extremely interesting because this particular attack can happen pretty much anytime. But the thing is that if it happened, for example, 6 months ago, now question is, how do we know that that actually happened? And there are a couple of things that could indicate, even after that time, that there is something bad going on. So first of all, what we're going to do, we're going to look at the machine. Yes, so let's do it. So here is the machine. We can sort by the process IDs for the simplification of this research. This, by the way, it's not because there is some vulnerability or anything. No. This is how it works because of the NTLM version 2 and SNB not being signed, which is a default actually. So here we go. We've got 3136, 3136. We actually do see that process. So we got 3136, yeah. So this is basically the one that we are migrating to. So I'm going to move down a little bit. So this is this one, 3136. But we don't have 2904. If we look for 2904, that process does not exist anymore. Now, why? Because when we migrate to 3136, that 2904 just vanished, yes? Now, 2864, that is this one basically. It is here. We've got this one. That's the cmd.exe. Yes, indeed, because that's the shell. But of course, if the hacker closes it, you won't see it anymore. And now what? So long story short, first of all, we can have a look at netstat. And with the option ANO, maybe, let's do more. And here we've got process IDs that are related with the communication. Now, funny fact is that if you have a look at the established connection, because it clearly stands out, we're able to see that the process ID assigned to that connection is 2904. But hey, didn't we just say that that process just vanished? Exactly, because unfortunately, netstat won't tell you the truth. Netstat, unfortunately, will show you only the connections or the process that was used when we were establishing a connection, and that's it. So simply, we cannot trust it. So is there someone to trust in the operating system, assuming that that attack happened a long time ago? Well, yes, we've got something that basically we call prefetch. And within Windows Prefetch, which is out there running for all the time, we've got a possibility to verify what were the processes running since you have set up your Windows. So let's do start dot. And here I have sorted these things by date modified. So you are able to see that eventually we've got more, netstat, process hacker, who am I? And then we've got this strange guy. That's this IYJR and so on. So this is quite interesting because it looks dodgy, but of course it might have a really nice name. So let's, in general, for the sake of our research here, verify if this could be this bad process. So what I'm going to do is I'm right now on the hacker's machine, and this is this attack that we were delivering. Yeah, and over here you can see that authentication was made, and then we've got uploading file IYJRD and so on. So that's this one, and that was also the one that we could confirm that was on the client side. Yeah, so this is basically this situation. Now, if it was called Who Am I, for example, or Notepad or something, then it won't look that strange. So how can we look inside? Of course, shift right click, copy as path, and over here, I'm going to go to our tools, where I'm going to use CQ, and in this case, Prefetch Parser. So in our team, we've got lots of tools like that, but this particular one, we're going to use with the parameter F for file. We're going to paste the path, and then we're going to do -A for analysis. And long story short, let me make a full screen. We are able to analyze a bit of details about what's going on inside a prefetch file. For example, here we've got run count 1. And run count 1 indicates that this particular executable has been running only once, and that is already quite suspicious. We can see when, but we can also see what kind of DLLs are loaded over here. So if this file has a name Notepad and it is actually malware, then we are always able to compare, for example, the list of loaded DLLs, whether it's the same as original Notepad or not. So Prefetch in general allows us to indicate what kind of executables were running in the operating system, even though process tracking, for example, as one of the logging methods, wasn't turned on. So Prefetch, it's not that detailed, but in a worst case, it helps you to understand if there was something suspicious actually running on your machine. How long do we maintain Prefetch? Well, since you installed Windows. So over here, you were able to find a history of everything that has been ever running in this operating system. That's one thing. Second, who can delete it? Well, Prefetch can be deleted by administrators. So long story short, if hacker knows what he or she is doing, then this person can go to the Prefetch folder and then eventually delete that trace. So it really depends on the situation. But actually, during this analysis, we rarely see that Prefetch is being deleted. What if it is deleted actually? Is it possible to recover, for example, deleted files? And answer is, of course, we can always do that.
So as you can see, guys, we've got a possibility to play with the network traffic. And then at that point, we are able to affect the way how people can authenticate to take over server or workstation. Let me show you a couple of things here. So there was a code that was executed, and that is something that is technically a bit of a mistake, because nowadays, especially dealing with ransomware, we are allowing in some organizations that ransomware to execute. Yeah, we know that, for example, from the news. So having this in mind, we've got the possibilities to implement whitelisting, or something that's called allo listing eventually. And this is something that would prevent us, the code like that, from running. And we're not only talking here about SMB relay, which could be fixed in many ways, for example, by implementing SMB signing, but also it could be supported by implementation of whitelisting. And that is also something that we consider as a configurational mistake and the problem of the current times that, for example, on the personal workstations, we've got that one that's not configured yet. So whenever we think about some other stuff, we've got over here old protocols or their default settings. So it really depends on the business applications that people are, for example, using. Like we might have applications that are using connection to SQL Server. And that is actually one of my favorite things that I'm checking within the pentest. So when you are sniffing to the traffic, then you can sniff, for example, traffic of or like a tabular data stream. So that stands as a TDS. And for example, within the Wireshark, you are able to use TDS as a filter. TDS, it's a communication to a SQL server. So for example, queries to a database, they will be running within the clear text. In vast majority of applications, especially the older ones, that is actually clear text, which is best for the pentest or for the attacker, because that's something that you can spoof. And that's something that could, for example, create you an additional account in SQL Server if, of course, you're going to have a privileged query. So that's one thing. And another one, it's trusting solutions without really knowing how to break them. So, for example, if we are using the multi-factor authentication, is that something that could be bypassed in a sense, so that when we take over, for example, the cookies for the certain application that user is using, could that be a way to bypass multi-factor authentication? Or another part is, if we've got antivirus solution, are we able to stop it by modifying the SDDL? And approximately 40% of antivirus solutions, they're actually allowing that. So that is something that we will need to check, how we're able to stop our security solutions, what in general are the ways to bypass stuff that we are using. So that is a bit of a thinking pattern here. And another part, it's misusing service accounts and in general privilege accounts. And for this one, I got a super quick demo where you guys are going to read how we are able to extract passwords from the service accounts.
Let me show you one of our favorite tools, which is CQ Secrets Dumper. So over here, you guys can see Paula's service, and it's running on the account Secure Freddy Krueger. So this is clearly not a built-in account, and there is a risk that this account, or under this account, we are storing password in the registry of this particular system. So how we are able to extract it? Well, that is actually Data Protection API system, and we've got a tool for that. And that is actually a problem for many organizations. So have a look. Here within the logon area, you can see Secure Freddy Krueger. And then eventually there is this particular password. And that is something that we're going to be extracting from the registry. Normally, it's not stored in a clear text in the registry of this operating system. So we will have to decrypt it. And then eventually we're going to be able to use it later, maybe within the attack. Who knows? So long story short, that particular secret, it is actually stored within the registry, and it is used because eventually Service Credential Manager has to use it. So let's see while we use CQ Secrets Dumper and we specify service PJ service. And in the moment, you guys are going to see that because we are running this particular tool within the administrative privileges, then eventually you can see that requested registry access is not allowed. Well, clearly, because that is a system secret and it is technically stored within the security hive. So we have to run psexec -s-i-d cmd.exe to elevate ourselves in the separate window to the local system. So with the option do not wait. And eventually here you can see that we are WhoAmI anti-authority system. And when we move to our toolkit, we can run again CQ Secrets Dumper /service, and we're going to name PJ service. And you can see that password this time is actually to be extracted in the clear text. So I've never seen an organization, by the way, that did not eventually have this problem. So it's good in the sake of security to verify what kind of services you've got that are potentially running on the regular accounts, because 100% password it's stored in the registry over there, because this is how, by the way, Logon as a service works, that you guys are actually able to extract passwords like this. Who can do it? As you could see, it could be actually extracted only by the local system, but you could also use the perform volume maintenance task privilege, for example, to copy the system and security hive and as well extract the password offline like this. So these are the possibilities while extracting passwords from the service accounts from the registry.
Okay, guys, so you are able to see how easy it is. So it could be that potentially misconfiguration of the workstation could be used as one of the steps that hacker technically could use in order to do one step further. And extracting passwords from the service account is just one of the 20 places. So it depends, of course, what kind of solutions you got, where we are able to, just like that, extract password from the configured service. So here we go. The last one, we've got falling for evil tools. And what we mean by this is that we are deciding to use a solution and at the same time, that solution might appear not to be safe. So that is a generic concept of the solutions that we decide to use, especially within the pandemic times, when we, for example, are switching immediately to the remote work and we're enforced to use something or get used to something that users are simply not used to. And that is something that I would love to show you in terms of multi-factor authentication and also the ways of how we are able to take over user workstation or in general users mailbox access. So call it as you want, because we can escalate this attack further, but at the same time, it is relying on the Teams communication or something that looks like Teams communication. Okay, guys, so I'm leaving you with this 11 key cybersecurity questions, which is an important thing to note, because every organization's security differs, but having this, for example, 10, but there's definitely more mistakes, situations that we are dealing with when working from home, maybe we are able to improve the security of the current user workstation or in general, our security posture. Here we've got informations and questions like, does our business culture support a secure cyber environment? Or within the second set of questions here, are we adequately resourced and insured? So by having answered these 11 key security questions that I'm always sharing with CISOs particularly, we are able to rethink our remote work strategy in order to prepare for the, I would say, not to be missed and definitely undoubtedly happening shift to remote work. And then within the summary, best practices, understanding it's definitely key to security, which means that the more we look at our infrastructure from the hacker's perspective, the more of the issues we are able to spot, especially within the user's remote work. Whenever we are thinking about the remediation and tracking, so the monitoring solutions, that's another perspective that gives us basically the view on what kind of things are executing on the user workstations or on the servers. So in general, well-designed monitoring and smart analysis about what's happening right now, filtering the segmentation of the network, the ALU listing / wild listing to prevent things that are unknown on workstations, things like attack surface reduction rules. So these are the things that are very easy to implement, but at the same time, being a good answer for the current remote work problems. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'm Paula Januszkiewicz, and enjoy your day.